Thanks everybody. I'm happy to be here. As Jody mentioned, my name is Lyn Brock. The picture that you see on the slide is not me. That's why I turned my camera on so you can see that that is not me. But I am going to talk to you in just a minute about who this particular person is. Just by way of saying a little bit about myself really briefly, I am a registered dietitian and I also have a master's degree in education. And I actually fell into teaching in kind of a roundabout way and was sort of feeling my way through, figuring it out as I went. And finally, at one point in my life, I said, you know what, I think I need to go back to school and learn what I'm doing. So that's why I went into the master's degree program in education. So that's what that's about. But by no means do I have it all figured out. I am always learning, just like you are. So please, with that caveat, I'm going to go ahead and talk to you a little bit about strategies for supporting adult learners. Did you all know that there is a world championship for public speaking? The woman that you see in the picture, who is not me, her name is Ramona Smith, and she is a high school teacher from Houston, Texas. She was the winner of the 2018 Toastmasters World Championship of Public Speaking. And it was a 6-month competition, and she had to outlast 30,000 other presenters from all around the world, and she emerged victorious. And the reason I'm using her example is because in an interview that I read, she shared one simple tip that she felt was integral in her win. And I'm going to share that tip with you, but not just yet. You're going to have to stay tuned, okay? So before we get into our content, I would like for you to chat your response. And it's a very simple question. What is your favorite thing to teach? Now, it doesn't have to be academic. Maybe you really enjoyed teaching your kids to ride a bike, for example. So it doesn't have to be anything academic, but I would like you to just take a second and chat in what's your favorite thing to teach? And Jody, if you can read out, I will pull up the chat too. Actually, I can't.
Okay, so would you like me to read them?
Yeah.
Yes, so how-tos, okay. Introducing folks to insects.
All right.
Program evaluation in gardening and cooking for kids. Things I love. Anything science. Constellations.
Oh, how fun. See, I'm already excited. And I'm going to come back to that question in just a minute, and feel free to keep on chatting those in. But I think, you know, it's important for us to stop and think about what it is that we love about what we do, right? And so that's why I wanted to have you take a minute and think about that.
And Lynn, some more are coming in, so let me know when you want to read them.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I actually have it pulled up. Oh, giant sequoias. I'm not a gardener, but I do love to teach people about cooking. Yes, absolutely. So thanks for all of those. So the reason I'm having you do that is we're going to come back to that question in just a minute. But before we do that, let me just do a couple of housekeeping details here. There is no possible way in this short period of time that we could talk about everything that's related to adult learning. So I picked two very simple goals for the time today. Simple steps that you can use to create workshops that are engaging and in which your learners will feel supported and that they will actually come away with some knowledge that they can use. So I will be asking some questions periodically, and feel free to go ahead and chat those, and Jody will helpfully be helpfully reading those for me. I will be stopping sort of partway through to answer some questions. So if you have any questions, please feel free to also type those into the chat box. And I am also happy. I know this is a relatively short time together, so I am more than happy to stick around for a little bit after the actual official close of the webinar as well. I want to just say a quick word about the title that I chose. Remember, the title was Please Step Away from the Podium. Well, I'm not exactly anti-podium per se, but to me, the podium is a representation of of teaching in such a way that you only are telling information to your learners. In other words, teaching that's information-based, that's sort of one-sided, and in that sort of lecture mode. And I'm going to propose that we really need to move away from beyond just providing information. And I'll talk to you a little bit about why I'm making that proposition. But I do want to say a quick word about podiums in general, or actually just any time when you are standing behind a podium or sitting behind a desk or a table. I think most of you probably can see quite easily that one of the problems with doing that is that you actually create a physical barrier between yourself and your learners. And as much as possible, we really want to try and take those barriers away. So I am a big proponent of getting rid of all of those contraptions and really getting out and engaging with your learners. But the podium per se is not really the issue. The issue is sort of the sort of traditional lecture style of presenting information. So the reason I think that we need to move away from that is based in this. There's actually a thing on social media right now called #YourWhy, and people use it for all kinds of things, but I thought I'd pick that one up. And I want you to just take a second, wherever you are, and think about why you teach. Some of you, and that's one of the reasons I asked the question to get us started, what it is that you love to teach people about. Probably you love that because it's a message or a topic that you really want to share with learners and that you really care about and you feel like would benefit them to learn about. But if you think about it, in order to really reap that benefit, the learner has to apply what they learn. And the ultimate goal for learners is to take action, whether it's adopting a new practice, making some kind of a change. It's taking some kind of action based upon what they have learned. So I'm going to ask you to think again for just a minute, and you can feel free to chat. And here's the question. I'd like for you to think for a moment about what that desired action would look like. If your learners really internalized what you're teaching them and put it into practice, what is one possible action that your learners might take that would indicate that your teaching has made an impact on them? So go ahead and think about that for just a moment. And I'm going to invite you to chat in some responses to that. What kinds of actions are you looking for your learners to take after you engage with them? Okay, maybe we can hear more about the exit ticket. That's very intriguing. Okay, smiling and nodding is definitely immediate feedback for sure. Asking questions is immediate feedback. Yeah, teaching or talking to other people, in other words, extending the learning out to other people, that is definitely an action step. Use the information to do what they have learned. Absolutely, yes. In our nutrition programs, we are very much oriented toward action steps. We build that into our curriculum. What are you going to do with this information this week when you go back, right? So yeah, so there are lots and lots of ways in which you can measure actions that your learners might take that shows that your teaching is effective. So think about that on an individual basis, but I also would propose that we have, besides our own individual whys, we have a collective why. And that is that A&R's impact in California is strengthened when we provide workshops and classes that engage adults and empower them to make changes. Whether, again, it's adopting a new practice in their work, or whether it's making a change in their eating habits or their physical activity, or changing some kind of pest control practice, all kinds of things that we could think of. So we're going to start by looking at our learning plan, and we're going to look at it, and by learning plan that can mean many different things. I'm trying to keep it fairly generic, but a learning plan is basically sort of a roadmap. It's sort of taking a journey, and like any journey, your learning plan is going to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And the beginning is sort of your introduction. The middle is your sort of meat of your content. And the end is where hopefully you're going to, engage your learners in some action step planning, right? So I'm going to look at this in a very simple way, but I'm going to propose that we think about our learning plan in this way. We want our beginning to be intriguing. We want our middle, our sort of core content, to be interactive. And we want our end, our conclusion, to be inspiring, right? So think about, just keep those three words in your mind. We want to have an intriguing beginning, an interactive middle, and an inspiring conclusion or end. So let's start at the beginning. So to have an intriguing beginning, what are some ways that you can create an intriguing beginning? And I put a quote up there from a writer, Sam Horn, and it's actually a female named Sam Horn, and she is a pundit about communication. She calls herself the intrigue expert. And if you like, I can share a link to her website, but she has this quote that I really like about, right off the bat, you want to get people's eyebrows raised. And sometimes that's easier to do than others. I hope that you were at least a little bit intrigued by learning, by the promise of learning how our Toastmaster won the public speaking competition. But basically, the key to intrigue is answering that question. Why should I care about what you're about to teach me about, right? Why should I care? Adults, this is a principle of adult learning, is that adults learn best once they can see why they would want to learn something. What's going to be the benefit for them, or what would be the detriment if they didn't learn this thing and take action, right? They need to have a reason for what they're going to learn. So that's the first thing that you're after, is creating an opportunity for the adult learner to figure out why they should care about what you're talking about. Some of the ways, and these are just a couple, just in the interest of kind of having a taste of things. Stories are a really great way to create intrigue. If you have a compelling story, there is nothing better. A good story connects with learners' emotions, and once you connect to the emotions, you are in. You have answered the why should I care question. And they can either be personal stories, but oftentimes I'm always on the lookout for a good story about whatever topic it is that I'm teaching. And sometimes in our nutrition education, sometimes the participants tell the story. So stories are one way. You can also sometimes use a compelling statistic or a compelling fact. And did you know, right, is a good way. But again, not just statistics, but how they actually affect people. I'm sharing this model with you. This actually comes from this group, the Center for Public Engagement with Science Information, Science and Technology. And it just proposes that, a lot of times somebody mentioned that you like to teach about science. Well, people who are trained up in sciences are taught, this model that you start with your background, you talk about your methodology, and then you report your conclusions. But when you're actually communicating with people, you actually want to flip that on its head and start with what that means to the people that you're talking to, and what's the so what about that information. So basically start with the bottom line. Okay, so before we get into the middle, right, the middle part, I'm going to launch a poll here, but I'm going to give you a chance to just read the question here for a second. 1 or 2 teaching skills that you feel like you would like to improve. Now, obviously we can't address all of them, but I will try and address at least 1 or 2 if possible. So I'm launching the poll right now. If you take a second and just, you can choose more than one. What are some teaching skills that you might like to improve? And again, this might be just by way of even having you contemplate this for yourself, okay? All right, so we won't take too long for this, but okay. Now, if you answer other, if you wouldn't mind chatting what your, in the chat box, what your other is, that would be great. All right, another couple seconds here. I am actually quite glad that so many people indicated being memorable, because I actually feel that that's extremely important. I'm going to go ahead and end the poll and let you see the results really quickly. But again, quite a number of you mentioned the concept of being memorable. So let's talk about that. Whoops, let's talk about that for just a second. So your middle part, remember, is where you want to be interactive. And again, there are many, many, many ways, many types of learning activities, which we don't have time to delve into, but I'm just going to mention 2 things. Number 1 is to keep things simple. And the second is to make it memorable. And the first step in making something memorable is to help your learner connect with their prior experience. So I'm going to talk about that for just a second. But let's, on the first point, really remember that there are actually many sources that recommend that you really should only try to have sort of 3 main points in any particular learning session. So there's a lot of ways you can structure that. I suggested one there. What's the problem? What's the solution? What's the action? But how can you make it memorable? So the first thing is to help your learners connect the new information with their prior experience. And I really am a big proponent of dialogue as one way to start that connection. Pose an open-ended question and ask the learners to discuss their experiences around that question, either in small groups or in pairs, or, a lot of people like to use the term turn and talk, right? Talk to your neighbor, that kind of thing. That's a great tool for, again, beginning to build that connection with the new information. By the way, I'm not going to really talk about presentation skills, but I am going to share with you, as promised, the tip that Ramona Smith shared that helped her win the Toastmasters competition. And it was as simple as gestures. And the gesture that she felt was really crucial to her was at particular intervals in her presentation, she would open her palms and turn them toward the audience. And she basically felt like it helped her feel connected to the audience. So even small things can make a big, big difference. A couple of other things. Some of you may be familiar with that's called the cone of experience, right? So if you look at the cone there, at the top represents, the fact that this is, starting at the top, this is what we hear, and moving on down a little bit, what we hear and see. Well, the idea is that we retain actually very little of things that we just hear. We remember much more what we experience. And one thing that I feel is important is, if you really want to get to that fat part of the cone, you let people experience things and talk about them. A couple of other tips for making things memorable. Of course, visuals can have a big impact. One thing I will say is make sure your visuals are visible. I like to have things nice and big so people can actually see what they're looking at. Things like wordplay, like the example I used was, I used alliteration, right? And I also used what's called a triplet, right? I said 3 words that all started with the same letter, right? So the beginning is intriguing, the middle is interactive, and the end is inspiring. Things like analogies or word pictures are also very good ways to help make things memorable. And I'll share one with you that I came across just recently. I was reading an article because I was trying to do some research on the use of hormones in beef cattle, and because we get people who ask questions about that. And this particular researcher who wrote this article said, the difference between an animal that's given growth hormones and an animal that's not given growth hormones is like one extra blade of grass on a football field, right? It doesn't really make that much difference. But I thought that was a great word picture. So,
Lyn, just reminding you, we have 5 minutes.
Okay. So we may not have time for very many questions, because I do have one last thing I want to share with you before we wrap up. But again, if you have any burning questions, I will take a second. Otherwise, like I said, I'm happy to stick around afterward as well. So I'm just going to pause for just a second. All right, so if we don't have any questions at this moment, I'm going to move on and just talk about the third part of our triad here. And I particularly use these words in conclusion. I read something that was talking about how in sort of audience studies, they've shown that when people hear the words in conclusion is when they start paying attention again. So we want our conclusion or our end to be inspiring. And I really am a proponent of concluding with some sort of call to action, if you will. Some sort of either goal setting, or it may be a very specific, immediate action that you're requesting from the entire group, like, sign up for our newsletter or something like that. One thing when I do action steps is I like to ask people to try on something. I find that it's a little less intimidating for people if I say, maybe this is something you might want to try on. Maybe you won't buy it, or maybe you won't, maybe you'll end up taking it back to the store, so to speak, but give it a try. And finally, I wanted to say a couple things about questions. There really is value in not finishing your presentation with Q&A, because it's sort of like ending with a fizzle, instead of ending with your inspiring conclusion. So a lot of times in live classes, what you might want to do is have people write down their questions on cards or things like that. In this case, we have the chat box. So speaking of which, I wondered if there was one idea that you heard, and I know this was sort of quick, but was there one idea that you heard about today that you'd like to try on? And if so, would you chat that in the chat box? Is there something that you would like to try on? Okay, thank you. Yeah, wordplay, sticking to 3 points. Thank you. Yeah, great. Okay, yes, and I definitely, as I said, I'm still learning just like everybody else, and I am always working on trying to make my beginning more intriguing. Yes, and gestures definitely I'm always working on. Yes, yes, I like that too. Thank you, Tammy. I like the did you know? Yeah, in fact, that actually came from Sam Horn, and she recommends asking 3 did you know questions all in a row, and then that is even extra intriguing, right? So it really helps, get people thinking about the topic. All right. Well, with that, that's the end of my prepared content. And I really want to thank you for your time and your attention. I know it was a sort of fast run through the topic, but that's what we're doing here. So I thank you. And again, I'm happy to stick around if anybody has any other questions. But with that, I'm going to turn it back to Jody.
Well, hi, Lynn. This is Mark Lagermany. I'm sorry I could not introduce you, but I didn't have permission to talk.
Oh, no.
At the beginning, but now I have permission, and I do appreciate you giving this information. It's very useful, and I hope even more people get a chance to look at your webinar later when they have the time, because a big part of what we do is being able to communicate, and if we're not reaching our audiences, we're not going to have the impact we want. And so I want to sign off for this particular session. Thanks for all of you that could attend, and Jody, I'll hand it off to you if you want to leave it open for anyone else that want to have.
Well, I'll leave it open to Lyn because Lyn said she would be willing to stay on for extra questions past the 12:30 hour.
Sure. But if anybody wants to log off again, thanks, and we'll see you another time. But I do see one question in the chat. So guidelines for the amount of time making points and then doing learner engagement back and forth. Yes, there are a lot of guidelines that are proposed by different educational theorists or practitioners, and they sort of throw numbers around like change modality every 6 minutes or those kinds of things. But it does depend, and one of the things that if we were doing a more in-depth look, one of the things that you have to consider is your audience. You always have to think about who is your audience. And even though in general adult learners may tend to have certain characteristics in common, of course not every adult learner is the same. And so in particular settings, you might be really conscious about changing up the whatever you're doing, So when we talk about changing modalities, we're talking about again stopping periodically to have some dialogue, right? Just stopping, turn and talk to your neighbor for a second, or having a hands-on activity, or having a group discussion, right? So there are all kinds of ways that you can do that, but in general, I would say if you're doing a class that's an hour, you're gonna want to change things up a number of times throughout that hour, and just in small ways. As I said, just pausing and putting out an open-ended question and having people discuss for 2 minutes, right? That it's amazing how much just that little bit of dialogue helps people again relate to the content and focus their attention back. Is there? I see one here. Is there a general rule for the length of a presentation style? Yeah, it's interesting. Again, there are many theories that are posited about that. At what point does an audience lose interest after 30 to 45 minutes? Well, it's actually, according to most most theorists, it's actually way shorter than that. It's probably more like 15 minutes, if that. And again, depending on what you're doing. So if you are literally just talking, lecturing, it's even shorter than that. It's probably more like, that number that I was throwing around earlier, something like, 6 to 8 minutes. So again, the idea is to try to change the focus, right? To change the modality. One thing that I do find interesting is, I don't know if you all listen to TED Talks, but I listen to them quite frequently, and one of their rules, so to speak, for doing a TED Talk is that your talk is, ideally, they want it to be 18 minutes or less, because according to their theory, that's how long people can pay attention. So if that helps you at all. But yeah, really, again, it depends on the particular group of learners, but you really want to try to put in some interactive elements quite often, is I guess. Actual breaks, that is a very good question. Actual, like, bio breaks and that kind of thing. Not that there aren't any guidelines that I know of, except for the limits on how long people can sit, and again, there are different ways of handling that. A lot of times, I just simply invite people to move around. I obviously, if I'm teaching a half day or a day long class, we'll give people a break. We'll give people, mini break, a couple breaks. But I also am a big proponent of just inviting people to make themselves comfortable. Stand if they need to, walk around if they need to, and I have had to learn just to not be distracted by that, and that seems to work fairly well. One of the strategies that goes into that is also having, because when people are standing, they still need, if they have materials, they still need a place to put their materials. So sort of having some standing tables and things like that is always helpful. So I don't know if that answered, please let me know if that answered the question or not, but yeah, I haven't ever seen any actual, guidelines for that. I think earlier on in the chat, somebody mentioned technology. I am not super great with technology myself, but I, again, have undertaken to try to learn some things. And I definitely take any opportunity I can to try to learn how to more effectively use different technologies. But I have to say, at least for me, even now, and I have actually talked to a number of other trainers and other educators, and web format is difficult. It's a lot more difficult to engage people versus having that face-to-face interaction. But effective use of the technology can definitely help with that. I have found personally, as far as Zoom, that the tutorials that they have in the Zoom help are actually helpful. I mean, I've sort of self-taught myself a number of things using those tutorials. So I don't if that's helpful to you. Okay, I don't know if anybody's still on. So Jody, if nobody's still on,
there are 11 people still on.
Okay. If anybody else has another question, I'd be happy to, because again, there were so many things that just in the interest of time didn't really have any time to talk about. I do have, by the way, I would be happy to share it. We did a session at the A&R conference, and I had some resource handouts that we developed for that, and I'd be happy to share them if anybody is interested in that. One of them is some different types of activities that you can do to sort of, again, practice those techniques of being interactive and some engagement techniques. Well, I'm reading your message, Karen, about attention span. You know, I have also done it. When I first started teaching, I started teaching nutrition and in you know a classroom setting, and you know, there's an adage in education that we tend to teach the way we have been taught. And so if you came up in the old school, you know, sit down and listen to the professor, you'll have a tendency to default to that. So don't beat yourself up, definitely. But just take opportunities to try to build in more interactive content. And I have to say, I'm quite jealous of you know, the people who get to do workshops all the time where they have all these hands-on activities, like, you know, like making jam and, you know, growing a garden and things like that. But if you don't have hands-on content, there are still other ways that you can make your teaching interactive. Okay, well, I think Jody is signing off, but I'm still on. I guess I'm still in control, so I can hang on. But again, I thank you for your interest, and I believe the link to the webinar had a link to me, and feel free to shoot me an email if you have a specific question. I don't guarantee that I have the wonderful answer for everything, but I'll do my best. So feel free to communicate with me. And thanks, everybody. Thank you for your thank yous. It was my pleasure.